One of the things that part of liberalism, socialism, or however you want to call it, is the destruction of absolute values and moral relativism and everything like that. And once you start tearing down those foundations of society, you can do anything. As a matter of fact, quoting, if I want to quote from the Communist Manifesto, it says, undoubtedly religious, moral, philosophical, and judicial ideas have been modified in the course of historical development, but religion, morality, and all that stuff survive. But for the communists, it says, they are besides eternal truths such as freedom and justice that are common to all states of society. But communism abolishes eternal truths. It abolishes all religion, all morality. Instead of constituting them on a new basis, it just acts in contradiction to them.
Yeah.
So that's what we're fighting.
Yeah, you know, and we're fighting that definitely politically. I am more critical of, you know, my Christian brothers and sisters, and just because God gave us that authority as Christians in a Christian nation to be the ones to speak out, and we haven't spoken out.
Well, dictatorships in general don't like God as competition, because there are three things that prop up freedom in a society. Dependence on absolute morality, dependence on knowing that your rights come from a creator, not from government, because if government grants rights, it can take them away, and a sense of individual responsibility. All three of those pillars rest on a foundation of a supreme being. You knock that away, and then everything comes crumbling down.
Yeah, and I think as Christians, we really need to stand for absolute truth, which is found in the Ten Commandments, and in a way, we've kind of let that crumble. You know, in our
right, and that's one of the
churches.
reasons that communism is such a godless form. All dictatorships, but communism is noted for being its godlessness. There are 10 points in the Communist Manifesto that are outlined, and I think it's a little frightening to see how closely that aligns with the Democrat and liberal agenda. Starting, for example, with number 1, abolition of private property, and we actually effectively did that in 2004 with the Supreme Court Kelo decision, which says that government can take property for any reason that it wants and give it to any person for whatever reason.
Eminent domain?
Eminent domain. And in fact, Sandra Day O'Connor, who wrote the minority dissenting opinion, said that it effectively abolishes all private property in this country.
Yeah, and we don't see it real clear right now, but again, it's going to be a stepping stone.
Oh, we see it. You can't turn on the news for a week and not hear, in some part of the country, someone's property being jerked out from under them just for the convenience of the government. But we didn't get there overnight. We went from the takings clause of the Constitution saying public purpose, then through a series of court decisions that got modified to from public use to public purpose, to where we wound up today with public benefit. But that's not what the Constitution says.
No.
And it's frightening that we got there. Point number 2, heavy progressive income tax.
That word progressive, we hear that a lot.
Well, progressive was a term that was coined in the 30s as a code word for communism, because people were afraid of communism, they didn't like it. So instead of saying communism, they talked about being progressive. But our income tax system is considered progressive. In other words, the more money you make, the higher rate of taxation you experience. Well, think about it. Taxation as policy is designed to stop things. You high tax on cigarettes to discourage people from smoking, right? When you tax something, you get less of it. If you tax income, if you tax prosperity, what happens?
Yeah, you get less prosperity.
You get less prosperity. And you mentioned biblical principles. Well, tithing is a biblical principle, but the Bible doesn't say that you should tithe 20% if you make more than a certain amount of income.
No. God isn't progressive, is he? You know, and it seems like with the media on the side of the liberal politicians, we're not going to get anywhere with this. In other words, they're going to constantly play class warfare until everything is distributed, you know, completely even. That's where I see us going. It's more and more and more progressive.
Well, one tenet of liberalism is guilt. And that's what class warfare is designed to trigger. One of the differences between free market capitalism and socialism, which is just communism light, is that capitalism is designed to spread prosperity and wealth and share the wealth. Communism and socialism, they're really designed to share the misery.
Okay, number 4. Number 3.
Abolition of rights of inheritance.
Yeah.
For years we've been trying to change the inheritance laws because family businesses, family farms, small businesses are often destroyed when the owner dies because the taxes are so prohibitive they can't pass the business on to their children.
Is this with death tax, or is there something in addition?
No, it's the death tax they've been trying to do. They've raised the limits, but that doesn't make any difference. It's just you can't leave anything to your children. And now there's a case to be made that, you know, children who inherit huge amounts of money typically squandered away, but that's not government's business.
No, it's not.
No. It destroys things that people build up. And that's part of the communist principle. Confiscation of property of immigrants and rebels. Well, we don't see too much of that.
Yet.
I guess, you know, in an environment where government's trying to gradually impose socialism, what we would normally consider free market activity is going to be considered a crime, and the penalty will be property forfeiture. Now, number 5 is scary. Centralization of credit in banks of the state by means of a national bank and exclusive monopoly.
And that's what we're seeing right now.
We're seeing nationalization of banks. And if you analyze a lot of the root causes of the banking problems, they actually originated in the far left. For example, in the mortgage crisis, there was a political action group that actually sued to force banks to loan money to unqualified borrowers. And that creates a poisoned portfolio. Well, it turns out that the attorney for that organization was a young man named Barack Hussein Obama.
Yeah. Unbelievable, isn't it, how the media was able to flip that over to George Bush. And I think we can blame George Bush.
And Barney
President
Frank
Bush,
and some others in Congress too. But there's no exit strategy for what we're doing. We're buying these, you know, there was some regulators that are really asleep at the switch. If, for example, AIG got to be so big it wasn't allowed to fail, it was too damaging to fail, then the problem is back to the point where perhaps some regulatory intervention to prevent that from happening. If a company's too large to fail, it's just like an employee that's too important to fire. First thing you do is get rid of them. And that would have cleaned a lot of stuff off the books. I don't see an exit strategy for any of the bailouts, whether it's insurance, the mortgage, the banks, the auto industry. I don't see an exit strategy right now.
And do you think that this is done on purpose? I believe, because I've heard enough talk about it, in the New World Order conspiracy, and this need to, well, you know, bring communism into the world.
I really don't know if President Bush initiated the bailouts. I know his Secretary of Treasury, Paulson, had a lot to do with it. I don't know if it's part of a conspiracy theory or not. I know that it was embraced by those on the left. Even Henry Kissinger, for example, recently said that this financial crisis should be used as an excuse to impose a world order. And that fits with liberalism in general, because liberalism feeds on human misery. It needs people to feel unhappy about their situation and to be miserable in order to support their agenda. And so it's the same way that Hitler came to power in the 1930s. It was a huge economic crisis. It was depression. And he fed on that misery, just the same way that liberals today excuse me, are feeding on the misery of citizens across the country as an excuse to gain power. And power in liberalism is the ability to redistribute wealth. And
that sounds good for some people who maybe don't have the money, but what it does is it gives the central government more and more and more power, And unless the government has a
Well,
really good heart,
here's
they're
the
going to...
problem. When you have 80% of the people taking money from the government that comes from the other 20%, and those 80% are also voting,
Yeah.
again, how do you go back from that edge of the cliff? Because eventually you run out of money.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and a government that's big enough, Barry Goldwater, Senator Barry Goldwater said this years ago, a government that is big enough to give you everything you want is a government big enough to take everything you have.
And we will see that, I believe, in our lifetime. And you know, really what's wrong with big business, because they provide a lot of jobs, they provide great health insurance, and a lot of people who work for big businesses are happy. Not that they're all perfect or run properly.
Well, health insurance,
really
let's talk about health insurance because, well, first of all, health insurance in itself is an artifact of government intervention. It came out of World War II during wage and price controls when companies were not allowed to increase the wages of their workers, so they started putting on benefit packages like medical insurance. Now it's been considered a necessity. But just because someone's sick, I feel for them. I have a chronic disease, diabetes, but I don't think that people I have the right to hold a gun at somebody's head and demand that they buy my test strips and my drugs. Yet that's exactly what happens when you say people have a right to something. In fact, that's one of the routes along the way to socialism, is declaring so many things to be rights when they're actually entitlements and privileges and things like that. Because once you declare something a right, then now you've got to provide it. But that's the fallacy, because if it takes a government to provide something, it's not a right.
Yeah, and when you look at our Constitution, what the government is supposed to do is to protect the people, such as if there's a need to go into Iraq, you know, that's protecting the people. It's not to give people more and more and more stuff and calling that a right. It was limited government.
That's right. In fact, what Congress is permitted to do is outlined in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. If it's not there, then Congress does not have the constitutional authority to do it. Yet there's so many things they do. In fact, when Iraq was writing their own constitution, people were joking, let's give them ours, we're not using it. But the fact is, it's been probably 100 years since Congress has actually stayed within the bounds of the Constitution in Article 1, Section 8. And it's been incrementalism. It's very gradual.
Yeah.